the way that YouTube works, it's almost better for current events channels and reaction channels, because it's like when you make a video, it only really gets attention initially. But if your channel is supposed to impart a timeless kind of teaching, it's like you end up saying the same stuff over and over again. So with no further ado, I'd say many people would concede that the participants in the modern economy at the level of worker are subject to a certain kind of bondage. They are bound by the necessity to feed, house, and clothe themselves. The difficulty with which this is done and the quantity and nature of what is extracted from the worker in the process varies by time and place. Workers have had it better and worse, and it's not wholly dependent on the economic and working conditions, though these are the outside variables that get manipulated. Workers are subject to monetary policy as the purchasing power of their wages is eroded by the easy money that's lent into existence every time the central bank decides to cut rates to stimulate the economy in the face of some crisis that was probably the product of moral hazard or malfeasance. As we've seen, that money has to grow in order to pay back the loans that created it. But the interest that also has to be paid back was not created with the loans, but rather had to be taken from the principal portion of some other loan. It's like a game of musical chairs. Never enough money in circulation to pay back the loans without more monetary expansion. Do you see how this has to happen? How the Fed has to constantly play around? Without the Fed's intervention, this fiat money game would eventually wind down with cascading defaults and the banks owning everything. Let's examine it as a game where there is only one round of money creation. Several loans are made where principal is created, but more than the principal must be paid back because there is interest charged. So in this one round game, it's essentially a race on the part of the borrowing participants to capture a share of this finite money pool sufficient to pay back the principal plus interest. And the other players can get crushed because there's just not enough money in existence to pay back their loan. In default, they would be subject to the terms of that loan agreement, and likely that would mean the loss of whatever physical collateral backed up the loan. So without bank intervention in the form of new loans, there is a 100% guarantee that somebody is not going to have a chair when the music stops. But in this game in which we find ourselves, there are multiple rounds, and the sheer quantity of loans being made obscures the reality of this single example I provided. When this game of fiat money is in full swing, there are side effects, consequences for both asset holders and wage earners to the extent that monetary policy is essential to keep the system going. When money gets lent into existence, the holders of those loan proceeds need to do something or buy something that will generate revenue or appreciate in value to where the loan can be paid back plus interest. So regardless of whether that borrower pays back the loan through industry or successful speculation in the purchase of an undervalued good, aggregate demand will be increased. Things will be purchased, and holding constant supply, the price level will go up. This is the very first thing that happens when a loan is made. A loan is made, a purchase is made, demand increases, and holding constant supply, then price increases. This is what you call inflation. It's really the consequence of monetary expansion. It's the money supply that inflates, and as a consequence, the price level goes up. The increase in price is due to there being more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. But the price of labor is the last thing to increase. This is called the Cantillon effect, named for the man who described it. So every time there is a threat of an economic slowdown, the money supply is expanded through the easy credit facilitated by the Fed, asset prices increase, increasing the asset holding classes, and the purchasing power of the currency is diminished. And the ones who are furthest from the money spigot are the workers, who then suffer mass layoffs when the Fed eventually has to reverse course and increase rates to fight the inflation. Then those higher interest payments increase the stakes and urgency of the aforementioned game of musical chairs, and then workers start getting laid off as a consequence. The system of usury under which we live, or I should say lending at interest. Usury, I guess, means a certain rate, but the system of credit under which we live is a headwind to the wage earner via the monetary policy that's required to prevent its inevitable collapse. As I said in a recent video, in the lead up to the end of a fiat currency regime, which comes when the temptation to plunder is too great and perverse incentives bring monetary policy that so skews the relationship between the money supply and GDP that faith is lost in the currency. In the lead up to that, human beings are put under such pressure that they resort to desperate measures, such as selling themselves in various ways. In that era, it was prostitution, I guess in this one too, but now there's different ways to prostitute yourself. This phenomenon is described in the book Fiat Money Inflation in France by A.D. White. Perhaps this is why the charging of a usurious interest rate is deemed to be sinful in certain traditions, or even lending altogether. Lending at interest is deemed sinful. In the micro, it creates this invidious relationship between borrower and lender. And in the macro, it creates a system of bondage whereby the borrowers must compete amongst themselves to pay back an aggregate debt that is greater than the money supply from which they must each individually pay it. And the imposition of this consequence on the population can be done at the whim of a central banker. The money system is just part of this bondage system. Regulation, as well as manipulations of the labor supply through the importation of workers, which not only affects the workers in terms of supply and thus their wage, but also inspires group conflict over resources. Divide and conquer, or divide and control. Another aspect of this bondage is the imposition of conditioning through the control of the institutions that do that. The stronger your body identification and the stronger your positionality, the more fear you will have, generally speaking. And in that state, the more security you need. The greater the fear, the more you'll do to mitigate. And you're much more controllable when you have something at stake. And conditioning cultivates that definition of what's really important, even if it's just in your mind. It's critical for your obedience to the system that you be hyper-focused on defending your territory from others. It atomizes you so that you cannot unite in resistance to it. It increases your marginal propensity to consume as you seek things to both secure the flesh and satiate the hunger that's of an unknown origin, which is actually associated with being disconnected from the truth. I'm speaking of the inner hole, which people try to fill with acquisitions and experiences. That hole is a product of spiritual inversion, the constant assault on the subject's circumstance by chaos, created by malfeasance from high places, puts at risk all of those things, be they subtle or gross, that conditioning has deemed sacred by those same ill-intentioned actors who placed it there through institutions and mass media. You have consented to be conditioned through the yielding of your attention to their content, and in such, there is simply no way to not be conformed to what they want you to be. This is why guarding the senses is critical. Your yielding of attention is a key part of the process by which you become the expression of consciousness that mirrors the mold that they created as content. It's possible to extrapolate the kind of person you want to create through the generation of content to which they are exposed. And the person who is formed into that desired mental and spiritual shape will defend tooth and nail those loyalties, the service to which destroy them mentally, physically, and spiritually. Guard your senses from anything that money created for your mental consumption. The whole Western world is full of people who are advocating for ideas that lead to discordia, and we've seen these things come to fruition. Discordia is good for the elites. They live in a world where people are content to live in opulence while others nearby live in cardboard boxes. If we see that anywhere, there's no reason why we can't see that everywhere. This is the same with everything. If you see something happening to a group of people, that could just as easily be you, assuming you don't fall into the scope of what their oppressors consider to be the human race. It is an important question to carefully consider. Would the people I'm rooting for do the same to me if I occupied the same space as their victim? Oppression and murder are motivated by greed and also insularity. The two go hand in hand. The more insular you are, the more identified you are with things that have to be defended through the acquisition of resources and violence. And also, the more identified you are with things that have to be defended, the more cut off you are from the truth. And therefore, the more you seek to fill that resultant inner void with outer things. The end of this rapacious behavior is not accomplished through the destruction of bodies, but rather the exposing of the mechanisms and manipulations that stem from these ideas of exceptionalism. There needs to be an exposition of the connection between insularity, exceptionalism, identity, and how they inspire violence and lead also to spiritual inversion, and how these ideas are contagious, as those subject to these depredations, like a protein confirmed to a prion, are themselves spiritually inverted through the cultivation of a countervailing identity to their oppressor. These ideas that deem others as not human or less human or not having souls, this othering becomes universal, blinding both victim and victimizer. Jiddu Krishnamurti said something along the lines of that to declare yourself this thing or that thing, like I am this nationality or this religion, is violence. I think there are other quotes similar to this by him, but the one I found is as follows. When you separate yourself by belief, by nationality, by tradition, it breeds violence. So a man who is seeking to understand violence does not belong to any country, to any religion, to any political party or partial system. He is concerned with the total understanding of mankind. So these are my words now. There's a connection between your state of being and the conditioning to which you are subject, assuming there is an identification with the body and mind to which it relates. If that connection is broken and what is left over is still functional, then you have escaped, at least spiritually and mentally. You will not escape it with an intact identification with a person. The world is just too bad to that thing for you to ever have any peace with it out there being subject to the world's insults and offenses. And in this is a bit of warning. The world is littered with half-baked spiritual aspirants, some even with huge followings and cults, who got lost somewhere over the threshold, but came short of liberation. They still wanted for something.